Hey, Coach Robert here. So we're going to do something a little new in this video. We're going to try to start doing this more often. But if you are a kid that works with me, one of the things that I do with one of my clubs is every first, third, and fifth Friday we have virtual chess club. You may notice that's when the videos premiere. That is for my virtual club, and right after the videos, we usually have a tournament on ChessKid. And so what I'd like to do is start going over the top game or the game of the top board and reviewing it so that you can appreciate how good these kids are doing and they can learn from it as well. And so each tournament, I'm going to pick one of the games that is either interesting or is among between the top players, and we're going to review it. So this tournament, which was our PHCC March Quick 1, our top finishers were some kids that regularly make the top 3. We had MontanaDrew finish with 4.5 out of 5. His only draw was to the second place finisher, EowynPHCC, who also drew with the third place finisher. And MontanaDrew and EowynPHCC are very often two of the top players, two of the top finishers. They do a lot of online USCF rated tournaments as well. And before all the COVID craziness, we were going to tournaments all over the place with them. So this is the game between EowynPHCC and MontanaDrew. We actually have Eowyn with the white pieces, EowynPHCC with white pieces, and MontanaDrew with the black pieces. Their chess kid ratings going into this game, EowynPHCC's fast chess kid rating was 1424, MontanaDrew's is 1601. MontanaDrew, I know, plays more on chess.com than on ChessKid, but he does do ChessKid for these tournaments for this club. Okay, so we start out with EowynPHCC playing e4. And I have watched a lot of these game review videos in the past, and it's always funny to me when, you know, the person plays e4 and the person doing the commentating makes a big deal. Oh, this is a great move. They're putting a piece in the center. They're getting ready to develop their knights and their bishop. Yeah, we know what e4 does. Okay, so that's what Eowyn's doing. e4, very standard first move. MontanaDrew responds with c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Now, the Caro-Kann is not something I typically recommend for my kids that I'm teaching to play, because if you really want to play this one, you need to study it a little bit. It's not something that is the purpose that you're going in there with it is not super simple to grasp. And there are a lot of lines, a lot of theory behind the Caro-Kann. And so unless you spend a little bit of time studying it, you may find yourself in unfamiliar territory pretty quick. However, I do know that MontanaDrew plays the Caro-Kann pretty regularly. He probably knows more about the Caro-Kann than I do. I do know that there is the idea here with the Caro-Kann is you're planning on playing the move d5 pretty soon to challenge that pawn on e4. So in that sense, it's kind of like the French, except for you have a pawn on c6 as opposed to e6. If you played e6 followed by d5, that would be the French. So it's pretty common after the move c6 for white to respond with d4. Generally, the rule of thumb is if your opponent lets you put 2 pawns in the center, take it. Put 2 pawns in the center. So we have next is d5, going along with the main idea of the Caro-Kann. Let's challenge that e4 pawn, and we get into the exchange variation where white plays e takes d5 and then c takes d5. Now the advantage here that black has is that black still has both central pawns at his disposal, whereas white's e-pawn is now missing. So black has a chance to play for the center. And that's going to actually be a really key theme in this game. One of the things that's really neat about this game is neither person really blundered anything. There are no major blunders, no major piece losses. There are some points as we go through the game where they play some inaccuracies that kind of swings the momentum to the other side, but they don't always catch it. But no major blunders. But the main theme that black needs to take advantage of here in this game is the central control, and that's probably the one thing black never actually does. He's going to own the center pretty much the whole game, but never use that to his advantage. Okay, so after that, we get some standard developing moves. We got knight c3, attacking the d5 pawn, knight c6. Don't really need to defend the d pawn because both of those pawns are protected by their queens. Knight to f3, bringing out the second knight. Bishop to f5. Which is pretty good. It puts the bishop on a good square. It's developed. An engine might like bishop g4 a little bit better, pinning that knight, but I can understand the hesitancy there. I've been burned by pinning the knight to the queen before, and then the knight breaking out with some crazy move, and I just end up losing my bishop. So I understand the hesitancy there. I think bishop f5 is probably just as good at bishop g4 right now, especially since all that's really trying to happen is get those pieces developed and pieces moving. Now, one thing you may notice is black has all four of these pieces still behind the four pawns, so the entire king side has not moved. Right? Not a single piece on the king side. And so black needs to think about that and get that rolling pretty soon. White does go ahead and put a pin on the knight with bishop to b5, which is a perfectly fine move. Another option might have been knight to e5 and offering to trade those knights and challenge the knight that way. Either way is good. Here, black plays a6. This is not great. The idea here is, okay, let's kick that bishop. I don't like the pin on my king. I'm not anywhere close to castling. I've got to get a pawn, my bishop, and my knight moving before I can even castle. So black is 4 moves from castling, whereas white can castle at any time. And so I understand the thinking here. Let's kick that bishop out. I don't like that bishop sitting there pointing at my king because now my knight is susceptible to attack. If white plays knight to e5, what am I going to do about my knight? So I understand the idea of kicking that knight out, but black really needs to get developed. And so this actually is not the best choice. So white goes ahead and trades off the bishop for the knight, which is actually not a bad idea. I know a lot of times you'd say, why would you trade a bishop for a knight? Well, in this case, that knight is 50% of black's developed pieces. And black isn't anywhere close to being able to develop the other pieces. So by trading the bishop for the knight, white will have 2 developed knights and a bishop with an open line and is ready to castle. Right, so white is thinking, okay, this right here hurts black because black has to spend a move recapturing, and white's in good shape. All right, castling comes next. White is 1 move away from finishing develop, and white is ready for the middle game, and black still has 8 pieces that haven't moved. Okay, so that sounds like white is just so much better. The truth is it's not. It's still pretty even. With all those advantages, black still has really good control, particularly in the center, stabilizing the pawns here and getting this bishop out. It's not nearly as bad as it looks. And what's white going to attack with? Even though black hasn't really moved anything, white doesn't have anything to attack the king right away. So we do get e6, allowing for development of the bishop. And honestly, I think the engine evaluates this as almost perfectly even. White with 0.16 advantage or something like that. Something really, really small. So it's still totally fine for black. Okay, so now we have a4. Again, this you're claiming some space on the queen side, but you really need to go ahead and get that bishop developed, particularly over to perhaps f4, because that's going to give you a lot of control over where black's bishop can develop. By not claiming the f4 square, this allows black some options on where to put the bishop. And black, MontanaDrew puts the black bishop right there in the center of the board, right on d6, the best spot for it. That a4 move just gave too much tempo to black right there. Okay, so we have b3, stabilizing that a4 pawn, creating an option for the white bishop to fianchetto if it wants, because the expectation is at some point black is going to pawn break, right? And if your bishop's fianchettoed and black pawn breaks, that's going to open up this diagonal for your bishop, right? So that's actually a pretty good idea if it gets used. All right, so instead we have bishop g4. Okay, if you're going to move bishop g4, you probably should have done it earlier. It's no use doing it at this point. What black really needs to do is to bring the knight out to one of these squares, probably e7, because if you put the knight on f6, it does create a more of a weakness on e5. You won't be able to use the f pawn to help control the e5 square. But really what white needed to do there, black needed to do there, was to move that knight out and get himself castled. Bishop g4 is fine. It just meant that you wasted a move by moving it bishop f4 earlier. So white decides to attempt to drive off that bishop. MontanaDrew just scoots the bishop back, maintaining the pin. White moves the queen out of the way in order to prevent being pinned any longer. That does miss a couple of opportunities. This is not bad. This is almost the best move. It's not quite, but there are a couple of different choices Eowyn would have had. This black bishop is a pain. This dark squared bishop on d6 is a pain. There was an opportunity here to try to trade the bishops with bishop c3. And even a5 isn't too bad, with the idea of perhaps eventually moving the knight over to b6 and then having a really, really strong outpost for the knight in black's territory. It's not so simple to get over there, because if you move knight to a4, that cuts off the line of sight of the rook with the pawn, and then the pawn would be hanging to the queen. But the bishop a3 idea definitely would have been useful to try to get rid of black's dark squared bishop. Instead, white EowynPHCC just goes ahead and moves the queen out of the pin. Again, not a bad idea. Just a couple of opportunities that might have been a little bit better there. Okay, now we finally get the knight developed. Knight to f6, totally fine. Knight to e7 is also totally fine. And then we have white putting a pin of her own onto MontanaDrew's knight. This is a relative pin, remember, so that knight can still move. Just because, didn't mean to grab that, just because there's a pin on the queen doesn't mean the knight can't move and do other things. Okay, so black's next move is to castle. Okay, what move are we on? Let me see what move this is. Move 13. Okay, move 13. Did not castle for 13 moves. Okay. I'm not... I would strongly recommend castling before move 13. Generally getting castled in the first 8 moves, 10 moves at the latest. MontanaDrew has survived this late castle, but it is finally castled. And believe it or not, this position is looking very strong for black. Having the bishop here centrally located with this, there's opportunities to pawn break at any moment. You get this pawn rolling. One of the things that's really interesting is, remember, this was a Caro-Kann opening, and this pawn right here, that's the C pawn. Remember, it started over here on C7, came forward, and then captured. That's your C7 pawn. This pawn over here on C6, which is where a pawn usually is during the Caro-Kann, that came from B7. So it's like MontanaDrew has the opportunity to play the Caro-Kann twice in the same game. How often do you get that? I mean, he's already taken out one central pawn with a C pawn. He has a chance to take out another central pawn with the B pawn. Okay? He doesn't do it. That ends up probably being the deciding factor of the game. He played the Caro-Kann once. He could have played the Caro-Kann twice in the same game. Okay, so back to the game. He has castled. He's got this great opportunity for pawn break using Caro-Kann Part 2. What do we have instead? We've got the knight rerouting. Okay, so this is actually really good. This knight sitting on C3 was not doing anything. Where's that knight going to go? There's a pawn sitting here. This square is doubly guarded by the black pawns. There's no way that that pawn was doing anything useful on C3. And so it is rerouting over to the king side where all the action is. We've got the queen pointed down the king side. We've got the bishop already on the king side. We've got the knight on the king side. We're even got a pawn rolling just a little bit. I can even see this knight coming over and trying to kick that bishop out a little bit more, right? So this knight is appropriately moved from C3 over to E2. And then we get bishop G6. Okay, this was the chance to play Caro-Kann Part 2. All right, I get it. You know, one of the things we talk about is power moves. Power moves are things that force your opponent to do things. In fact, I think right before this tournament, they even watched a video that was called, one of my other videos called moving your opponent's pieces, where you take actions that force your opponent to respond, and how frustrating that is. And one of those power moves that can do that is attacking the queen. And so I get it. This was a common move, and I can't complain about this move at all, because this forces the queen to do something. The queen has to respond. And I know white is thinking, hey, look, I've got this C pawn that's kind of loose, right? There's nothing here guarding the C pawn because it's backwards. The rooks are still sitting on A and F. And so here's a chance to maybe put some pressure on the weak C pawn. Turns out the C pawn is not actually hanging, okay? Because black also has a backward C pawn. So white's best response here is actually just to scoot the queen over to E3 and pretend like you're ignoring the C pawn. Because if black takes that C pawn, then you're going to have the rooks come into the game. Either rook coming in is fine. But the problem is, if black can't take this pawn because he just loses the bishop, so the bishop has to retreat, probably here. That way it's you know what, this might be just as good. Bishop E4 is good, getting some pressure here, but then white's rooks infiltrates, and the other rook is going to come in behind pretty soon. And so that C pawn actually wasn't loose. If black had taken the C pawn, white doubles rooks on the C file really fast, and that is not good for black. But instead, white did not realize that the pawn was not loose, it was not free. White scoots the queen back to d2. And that was probably the worst move in the game so far. Not a horrible move, but we're talking probably a little bit more than a pawn swing. Black comes in with this awesome move, knight to e4. Remember how I said earlier that knight wasn't actually pinned, right? But black would also be able to take the queen, threatening both the knight and the rook afterwards. So that's actually a pretty solid move. White decides to protect the queen, which is okay, but believe it or not, trading queens is probably the best bet for white right now. Yeah, this killer move, this knight e4 was just a huge blow. Black then goes ahead and captures the bishop and is up a little bit of material now. But obviously the knight's recaptured. And this is, so all that we've done at this point is we've swapped the knight for the bishop that was pinning it. Pretty interesting that happened, but then black makes the mistake and captures the c2 pawn. Like I said, that right there opens up the c file for white. Black should have gone ahead with the pawn break now. That would have been the best thing, even given the fact that this knight over here at f3 used to be helping this pawn. It's gone now, and so the pawn break is even more effective than it would have been. Instead, black goes ahead and captures the not hanging c pawn, and we do get rook a to c1. Black can black's best move probably is to just retreat the bishop, because well, you'll see why in just a second. Black decides, hey, actually this queen is guarding the knight, right? Which means the queen is not guarding this pawn. And so MontanaDrew thinks that this is a free pawn, and it's not. It's not a bad move. It's not that much of a swing in the game at all. This is a totally fine move, but it does create some weaknesses because EowynPHCC finds a really cool response with knight takes e6. Now, this actually wasn't a great move, but the idea was great. So you see now, EowynPHCC grabs a pawn and threatens both the rook and the queen, and so MontanaDrew has to respond. MontanaDrew has to capture, which allows EowynPHCC to go ahead and take the bishop. And so they both lost a pawn and a minor piece, as opposed to anybody losing just a pawn. I remember seeing it in the game and thinking, this is a really weird sequence, but this is just some high-level stuff. These kids are doing really good stuff. And so once I had some time to take a look at it, I saw what was going on. But, you know, they're playing this in a 15-minute game. This is not something where they could sit there and think and think and think and think. They both took a bit of time on these moves, and both of them had some really good ideas. Now, when Eowyn takes the pawn on e6, I said that was a great idea, but it wasn't a good move. She should have taken the h7 pawn. That would have been the best move, almost equalizing because when the king takes, now the king is out in the open. Or the king can just ignore it and save the bishop. That actually is probably the best move, is letting the bishop take and the knight run away again. What that would do is would give black an outside passed pawn. Yes, they are a little weaker on the king side, missing that pawn, but it would be very difficult for white to navigate the pieces over to the H file to apply any sort of attack. Okay, so yeah, knight takes H7 would have been better. Knight takes E6 is still pretty cool. Okay, so we've got queen takes B3, and we are still waiting for Caro-Kann part 2. That's what we need to see happen. We need to see Caro-Kann part 2. Instead, we have attack on the queen, which is totally fine. This is actually a good move. Again, it's a forcing move, but it just allows the queen to find another square. Now, the best move for the queen is what EowynPHCC is missing here is don't just retreat. If you're going to retreat with an attack. Okay, white has some pawns that are weak. In fact, there are 3 of them that are backwards pawns. Not a single one is protected. So this retreat does attack one of them. But that's the one that's probably going to get involved in the pawn break soon. A better way would have been for EowynPHCC to move over to D3, putting the attack on the A pawn. Because if that A pawn falls, then EowynPHCC would have an outside passed pawn, which would be a constant threat for the rest of the game. Pretty easy to stick a rook behind it and bring the other rooks and knights over to help out. But like I said, instead she goes to C2. Again, not bad. D3 is only marginally better. It's not that much big of a deal. So still waiting on the C5 move. And we get rook C8 to prepare for it, or that seems to be preparing for it. And then we get knight to G3. That kind of removes the knight from the central action, and it doesn't really give the knight any good squares when you think about it. The knight's not going to jump to either of these 2 squares because those are already attacked by the pawns, and sticking it over on H5 just looks bad. What's it going to do on H5? The queen is not targeting G7. There's no checkmate threat over there. So this move actually it doesn't look very good. This knight is not useful on G3. The best thing for MontanaDrew to do is leave it alone. As long as it's sitting there, it is out of the game. It is not helping. It is no longer protecting the D4 pawn. So it's just no good. MontanaDrew takes it. This may have been one of the It was a mistake. It wasn't a blunder or anything like that. It does do something interesting. It does create a really bad pawn structure around the king, right? That's kind of ugly. But the king can always slide up to H2 and be pretty safe. Remember, we've got queens and rooks still on the board. Putting together some sort of mating pattern with queens and rooks with an kind of open position. We've got some open files. Isn't great. And this also opens it up to simplify a little bit. But the big thing is MontanaDrew just threw away his last chance for Caro-Kann Part 2. Without the bishop sitting on D6, C5's just not going to happen. And, oh well, I was really looking forward to seeing the Caro-Kann play twice in one game. So anyways, we have rook takes. Obviously that has to happen. Now Montana has to figure out something to do. I said he has no more chances to play the Caro-Kann Part 2, but actually he does. All he has to do is replace the bishop with the queen. If he does, not only does he have the chance to play the Caro-Kann Part 2, but he also targets the G3 pawn, and after the move C5 is protecting the a6 pawn. That d6 square is perfect for the queen. The only piece that would be better on d6 than the bishop is the queen. So Montana plays the queen to g5. That was the biggest mistake of the game. That was the largest shift in the game. This was almost a full 2-point swing according to the engine. White should be able to play and gobble up pretty much all the pawns at this point. The king, there's no real good threats on the king here. It removes the protection from both the a6 and e6 pawns. The black king is not particularly safe if the white queen ever manages to get to e8. As long as the rook's not there, it's checkmate. So this is just, yeah, not great. If even on d6, d6 still protects the f8 square. So you're not going to see any rooks coming in there either. Unfortunately, that was probably the biggest mistake. There are some more mistakes to come. But let me tell you, when you're playing queen and rook endgames in a 15-minute game, first of all, it's a 15-minute game. They're already low on time. They're already less than 5 minutes. Trying to find the perfect move is so hard. And so this was, sure, this was not the best move, but I get it. I understand. You see a loose G pawn. You're like, okay, let's go get it, right? So, white plays king to h2. Not the greatest move. A better move would have been for white to go ahead and start targeting the pawns, right? Queen to e2 hits both the e6 pawn and the a6 pawn. That was really what white needed to do, particularly the e6 pawn. That's what's really devastating. If we see queen e2, this pawn is not free because this is a fork, right? So queen e2 wins the game, right? Because black has to retreat to defend the pawn. And so when the pawn is defended, so we'd see queen e2. Let's go play through a couple moves. We've got queen e2, followed by queen g6. Queen e7 is also an option. That's probably even, I don't know which one's better. Queen e7 is also an option. And then you get to snack on the a6 pawn. And you're a full pawn up in the endgame. It's an outside passed pawn. Black has a 3-to-1 majority pawn in the center and is not using it. It's not getting used. It should have been used already. And so that's what could have happened. But Eowyn missed queen e2 and instead played king h2. One of her biggest mistakes, again, not a huge mistake, but this made the game even again. She had a clear advantage after queen g5, and this just kind of brings it back to even. Then MontanaDrew just kind of doubles down and decides to infiltrate, coming in now, still keeping an eye on the g3 pawn, but also attacking the d4 pawn. This is the only pawn that EowynPHCC has in the center of the board, and so by taking that out, MontanaDrew would have 3 passed pawns. Even so, it's too easy to defend. The queen is not very safe. A better move would have been just the simple e5, right? Go ahead and pawn break on the king's side, which would allow the queen to move back into a better position where she might be able to defend the e6 pawn better and help escort these 2 pawns down the board. But we have queen e3. The rook comes over to guard, and that was probably not the way to do it. Instead, queen c5 would be better with the threat of coming down to a7 and grabbing the a6 pawn, because even at a7, the queen would still have eyes on d4. And so if the queen, if the black queen ever left, the a6 pawn is gone. So instead we have rook d1, which was that was actually pretty big miss by EowynPHCC. That's a couple of misses in a row. But again, these queen and rook endgames are, especially with all these pawns on the board, it's so hard to find the right move. Both of them are low on time, so you can't really blame them for these. These are not grandmasters that are playing, you know, 2500 level blitz games or bullet games. So next move, rook comes over to the open file. Again, this is a principled move. It's not a bad move. The only problem is that the king safety. It might be good to go ahead and push h6 here at some point, but it's still not a bad move, and it still allows this queen to c5, but instead now it just hangs the pawn all together. All right, so the pawn is taken. So not a particularly sound sacrifice. What needed to happen was get the king to safety so that the rook could infiltrate more safely. So the idea was, let's get the queen and rook down here, stacking up on with an attack on the king. But that is probably most easily met with rook to. So okay, let me back up. When the queen comes to e2, yes, there is now a pin on this immobile g-pawn that can't move anyways, even if it wanted to, but it does attack the d-rook, the rook on d1. So obviously we can't ignore that. Probably the best thing to do is maintain your advantage here. Don't give up eyes on the a6 pawn. Just scoot the rook back. You know, rook b1 is great, because what's black going to do if black tries to infiltrate with something like rook to f2? I mean, that's a huge mistake, because now we got the open file. The queen is going to be able to come to here very soon. Obviously not right away, because just block with the black rook. So there's really no threat of an attack on white's king if the rook is on b1. Instead, EowynPHCC gets a little nervous about defending the rook and comes back. Again, she had an advantage, and this just kind of brings it back to an even game. So the rook does come in, and Eowyn defends with rook g1. If she wanted, she could have checked the king first. That would have been completely fine. She did not need the queen back here on c1 for the rook to defend, because I don't know if you know this, but rooks don't attack diagonal, so that rook would be safe even with the rook and the queen sitting right there. There's no chance of that rook getting kicked out. Okay, so we have rook to g1. That's defended now. The queen comes to e4, thinking, okay, let's have both pieces with eyes on the pawn, which doesn't really do much. I think MontanaDrew might have been thinking about grabbing the d pawn. Again, the problem is the check is coming, and after the check, it's not just a check, it's a fork, and the a pawn's going to fall. And so by moving the queen off of this diagonal here, MontanaDrew loses eyes on the a pawn, and that becomes really important. We have check, defend with the rook, and the a pawn falls. Okay, at this point, Eowyn has a huge advantage. An outside passed pawn. MontanaDrew can take that pawn, but even that, the engine says that's a bad move. Your king is not safe where it is. The queen and the rook are going to be able to double up on that king way too fast. Give it some space to breathe. So we've got queen takes d4. Another problem is when you took d4, you hung your e-pawn with check. Okay, Eowyn misses it. Eowyn plays rook e1. But this is probably Eowyn's second biggest mistake. Yeah, should have just gone ahead and take it. This was about a 1.5-point swing. But it's followed up by another mistake with e5. Again, MontanaDrew needed to create some space for the king. There's too much chance for attack here. And here comes Eowyn's biggest mistake of the game. All she needs to do is bring the queen over. That right there. And then once the king moves over, you've got... sorry, let's take that with the rook. Yeah, you take the pawn with the rook, and then there's no saving this pawn. Black used to have a 3-on-1 pawn advantage in the middle and is about to lose all of it, and still has checkmate threats, back rank mate threats. Instead, Eowyn plays queen to e2. That put the game right back to even. She had the win right there with queen e6 and missed it, played queen e2. Again, though, man, these kids are probably under 2 minutes at this point. There's not a lot of time left on the clock, and they're just trying to push out moves, and they don't have time to look at everything. So, you know, hindsight's 20/20, and you know, you can't really fault them for this. Montana plays the correct move by pushing the e-pawn. Eowyn starts moving her own pawn, pretty soon moving it to where it's inside of her queen. Montana plays the rook over to protect against the advancing a-pawn, which is not bad. This might have been an opportunity to try to force some trades with queen f2. That might have been a little bit better, because that you always want, if possible, you want your rook behind your opponent's pawns. You want your rook behind your pawns too, to support. And so if there had been a queen trade here, then there would have been some opportunities for these pawns to come off the board. Anyways, instead we have rook over to a8, which is totally fine. It's a decent move. The pawn push, this is totally fine. This is a fine move. An interesting move would have been something like queen to g4, or maybe even queen to h4, because let's just put that on board. If you have queen h4, queen h5 and rook takes, that blunders mate in one. So, you know, there was that chance. You don't really lose that by playing a6. In fact, it almost might be a little bit of a bait, because you could then pretend like you blunder the a6 pawn and move queen h4. Then we have queen d3 offering the queen trade. Probably not the right move here. Again, the king is sitting and in danger of back rank mate threats. Even the rook sliding over and the queen getting around to the back is fine for a mate. And Eowyn still has the queen h5 trap. Instead, they do trade queens. This again, at this point, the game is pretty much even. The rest is just negotiating the terms of the truce, making sure nobody makes a huge blunder, very cautiously moving the pawns forward until MontanaDrew is able to sit this pawn on g5, completely blocking the 2 g-pawns that EowynPHCC has. Again, then there is just some negotiation on settling on terms, and at this point, there's no progress to be made. Both these kids are plenty strong enough to know not to walk too far away. Eowyn tries to see if Montana will step back a little bit and give her a chance to get up to the f5 square, but Montana's not going to let that happen. And so after just a few more moves, it ends in a repetition draw. Guys, that was a phenomenal game. For kids at our level to play like this was terrific. Okay, so I was really excited to look at this game. There's so many neat little things. The biggest areas of improvement for each kid was MontanaDrew needed to take the center and pawn break in the center. Had several opportunities to do that. When the bishop left the center, it needed to bring the queen to the center, and basically that's the whole point of having that pawn on c6. I know Montana plays the Caro-Kann where the exchange is refused, and generally in the Caro-Kann, when it's not the exchange variation, you do end up with a c5 push eventually, undermining that d4 pawn. And so it was funny seeing him play a Caro-Kann exchange and get the opportunity to also get the other Caro-Kann lines in the same game. And so that was his big mistake throughout the game, was missing that. Eowyn missed several tactical shots where she could have done some forks or done some maneuvering that would win some pieces. And those forks were always pretty simple forks. They were pawn and king. They weren't like, you know, king and queen. She had some really great ideas with grabbing that pawn with the knight. But every time one of them took an advantage or gave away an advantage, the other one failed to make use of it. And so the game stayed pretty even the whole time. There was never a point where the game was just lost for one person or the other. Very even, very solid game by both kids. There is a reason why these two regularly finish #1 and #2 in our tournaments. So I hope you all enjoyed this analysis. I look forward to doing more of these. Expect these to come out every couple of weeks, every time we have one of those tournaments. And if you are interested in joining in on some of our tournaments and trying your hand against MontanaDrew and EowynPHCC, leave a comment, and maybe I can, if you're a kid that likes to play chess, maybe I can get you in on one of these tournaments. Okay, keep playing, keep having fun. See you next time.